Kimberly in South Africa is a famous little mining town. It was the second city in the world with electric streetlights, paid for by the diamonds that saw thousands upon thousands rush into the area in the late 1800s. What is now a famous tourist attraction, the Big Hole, was dug into the earth as fortunes were made. For some, however, Kimberly has been less than lucky. In 1987, with the apartheid system in full swing, the murder of an 8-year-old girl of color managed to pass like many others without being solved. The man who would turn out to be South Africa's longest known active serial killer would begin his career as it would continue, with a murder slipping through the cracks. Inspector Luis, could we do a very technical thing at the beginning? I'm just going to ask you to state your name and what your job is. So I am Inspector da-da-da, and I am a da-da-da.
Fernando Lewis. I'm a colonel in the South African Police Service. At the time of the investigation, I was an inspector. I held the rank of inspector at the Serious and Violent Crime section of the South African Police Service in the Northern Cape.
Colonel Lewis, can you tell me, how did you become involved in the police service? Was it something that you knew you would do from the time that you were young? It's
something I always wanted to do. I first did my national service, which was in the Navy, the South African Navy, which after that, I decided to try and join the force in that. It was at that time, my dad wasn't for it. And after he saw that my commitment was I always wanted to be a policeman. And then he gave me his blessings and said, go and become what you want. Go and become what you want. So that was it was a dream from a little boy to be a policeman. And it's something I love. And I love till today, I still love it.
So yeah, you knew from a young age this was a passion of yours, and that it wasn't just going to be a job. Can you tell me about when you entered the police service and you accomplished you had achieved that first step in your dream?
It was I joined the police force in November of 1990. I was sworn in, and then I went to the police college where I was trained. And just shortly after that, I was posted in Soweto, in the Gauteng province for a short period of time. And then afterwards, I was transferred to the Northern Cape, where I worked in the uniform section for maybe 3 months. And then I became a detective. And that is when I realized I had the passion of being a detective. So it was from 1991, about November. It was after being a year in the force, I became a detective. And that's where my love grew for being a detective, because it was something that every day is a different day. Every day is a new beginning. There's always something new and something challenging. It's never the same story every day.
Let's talk about the Tommy Williams case a little bit. I know this took place in a town called Kimberly. Yeah. Can you describe Kimberly for me?
So Kimberly, I mean, is quite a historic town. Diamonds were discovered there, quite a while ago. And that, of course, led to a huge diamond rush. And the big company De Beers was pretty much formed out of that Kimberly sort of whole diamond rush. If you actually go to Kimberly now, they'll talk about the Big Hole, which was really an open pit mine that was all little people with little claims. And this pit is literally, I think, 100 meters, if not longer, deeper. It's now filled partially with water. And that's the original sort of diamond mine that was formed by the people who were coming in at the time.
Is it a diverse town, and what is the economy like?
So it's very similar to other small sort of towns in South Africa. I think it's not as well off as it used to be when it was initially, the hub of the diamond trade. That certainly has faded quite some time ago. It's more, it's important from a tourist and a history perspective now.
Right.
And there are, small industries there, but there is a very large portion of people, as in many towns in South Africa, where, they are living hand to mouth, but in communities that are really linked by the difficulties that they're experiencing on a daily basis. So really close-knit communities.
It's a very close-knit community. Everybody knows each other because it's small. It's not a city. It's a town. Although it is the capital of the Northern Cape, it has quite a large speaking Afrikaans community as well. When I got there in 1991, it was mostly the most spoken language there was Afrikaans and Tswana. English wasn't so well. It was spoken amongst the miners, but not amongst the general population. It was mostly Afrikaans. So it was quite an adaptation to that as well, because you've got to get used to that culture of how they think and what they do there. But they receive you very well. It's a very open community that receives you very well.
Is Kimberly, is it a dangerous community? Is it riddled with crime? And are there many missing persons and murders in that small town?
I wouldn't say crime rates. Look, there's petty crime as there's everywhere. I think there's a lot of alcohol abuse amongst sort of the lower socioeconomic group, perhaps for historic reasons also. So there you would get in the sort of townships on the weekend, perhaps a lot of knife crime and robbery and drunk people doing drunk stuff that gets arrested. It's definitely, I mean, the whole Northern Cape province, which is where Kimberly is the capital, has probably the lowest crime rate of all the provinces, significantly lower, but it also has the smallest population. And it's very sparsely spread out. So you'd have Kimberly, and then, for 50 kilometers, nothing till you get to another tiny little town. So it's a very sparsely populated, which means we tend to not have, for example, bank robberies, because there's nowhere to go compared to the city where you can disappear easily, or cash and transit robberies we typically see in South Africa, where people are transporting money in these armored vehicles. In South Africa, those often get knocked and hit and robbed. Right. That doesn't really happen in Kimberley, in the Northern Cape, because the distances are too far. There's nowhere to run. Right. So in general, probably safer than the most. But we've had definitely some interesting murders that have taken place there over the years.
So it's not a community, well, for example, in Joburg, if a body turns up, it's not big news. If a body turns up in Kimberley...
It's bigger news.
It's bigger
for sure.
News. Yeah. Tommy Williams is known as South Africa's longest active serial killer. Okay. Can you give me a little bit of the chronology of the crimes that he's been convicted of?
Sure. So the first case that we now know of, which was not known when it was committed, was in 1987 when he was 16 years old.
16?
Correct, yes. An 8-year-old girl called Martha Botha disappeared from a small town in Kimberley. And in that same town lived Tommy Williams. He actually recovered her body and reported it to the police. But at the time, it being 1987, they perhaps didn't believe that a person so young would be capable of she was strangled, and they believed she had been raped as well.
Right.
So that was his first crime.
In 1987, 8-year-old Martha Botha was next-door neighbors with a boy named Tommy Williams, who was, at the time, the last to be seen walking with her. When he discovered her body days later whilst supposedly urinating at a nearby disused stadium, close to where she was last seen with him, nobody seemed to immediately link Tommy to the incident. An autopsy reported the cause of death as strangulation with evidence of sexual penetration. Despite his clear links to the victim, Williams was at the time treated only as a witness.
And there's a significant gap and a worrying gap for me, which I would really love to delve into if we could, from a law enforcement perspective, because I think there's more there. But the next time we see Tommy Williams on the map is very close to where he lived in Kimberley, where Martha was killed, and that's in 2004. When a 13-year-old boy, Tabang Bihi, goes missing from his own home.
In 1987, then 16-year-old Tommy Williams had gotten away with murdering his first victim, an 8-year-old girl named Martha Botha. She was his next-door neighbor. 17 years later, in 2004, 13-year-old Tabang Bihi was found murdered and disposed of in a house that was being guarded by none other than Tommy Williams. The discovered body was wrapped in part of a duvet cover, whose other half was being used inside the home as a curtain. While they looked for Tommy, police called in a crime scene photographer to assess the interior of the home to identify whether any blood residue revealed potential additional crime scenes. Evidence was mounting to suggest that the child had been murdered inside the home and then buried in the shallow grave.
So on an afternoon, sort of like any other, 13-year-old Tabang Bihi is home alone. His parents will come back from work in the afternoon or the early evening, as they usually do. And when they come home that day, they don't find Tabang home. His father found that their house had been ransacked, items had been stolen, and his son was missing. And initially, police wanted to almost put the blame on Tabang and say, oh, well, is he not maybe in with the wrong group of friends? Did he not steal these items? There were electronic items missing. Did he not steal these items and run away? And Tabang's father, to his credit, was adamant that he knew his boy and his son would not have done that. So a missing persons case was opened for Tabang.
Can you recall becoming involved in the 2004 murder case, and how did that wind up on your desk?
What happened there was a colleague of mine had the case docket of the missing child, which they were looking for in Tabang B and that. His dad reported him missing, and the child, they believed the child was taken to Kuruman area and that. And then my colleague went on leave, Lizelle Smith. She was the investigator at that stage. And that's when my commander at that stage, Leonie Verster, gave me a call the one evening and said to me, you need to come out with me to a crime scene. And then they discovered the remains of a child in the backyard in Warrington, in a shallow grave, and with a possible shoelace around the neck and that, and the decomposed body. And that's where the story came out that Tommy Williams was involved. He was the guard looking after the house at that stage. And he had just left, and it's a new security guard. It's a repossessed house from the banks. The banks had repossessed the house. So it was an empty home where the guard was staying inside the house and guarding the house so they wouldn't be vandalized or stuff taken from it. So when this new guard, he started cleaning the backyard, and then he came across the remains of this skull in the ground, in the shallow grave. And then he notified the police. And when we got there, we asked questions, and the child was basically buried in a shallow grave, but at the bottom, the torso, and it was wrapped in a part of a duvet cover. Now, the duvet cover that it was wrapped in, there was in the house, it was hanging he used the duvet cover as a curtain as well. Now, the portion that was torn out of it matched the portion that the body was wrapped in. And then that security guard said to us, but this curtain was left here by the previous security guard, which was Tommy Williams. And that's how Tommy Williams came into the picture of this is possibly a suspect because the curtain being linked to him. And that's when we started investigating, and we started looking for him, which we found him. And when we questioned him, we found a gold chain on him. We found the screwdrivers to Tabang B's dad on him. And then at that stage, he denied it. And then afterwards, he denied that he was Tommy Williams first. And then afterwards, we could able to link him as Tommy Williams, the person called Tommy Williams. And then he said to us, no, but he was accosted by another person, and he was told to hold the legs, and this person strangled the child, and that. But all that didn't make sense to us, because why would you do all that and not go and report it to the police? Everything led it to him. And he was basically formally charged. We opposed his bail successfully. He was kept in custody. We were waiting to go to trial, and then we linked him as well, because the gold chain which we found on him, that was by his girlfriend, which she gave back to us, belonged to Tabang B's mom. The screwdrivers, his dad worked for Eskom, so the screwdrivers had the name on it as well, so that was also linked to the family as well. And then it was basically, it was, yeah, that's how we linked him at that stage. There was stolen property that was linked, and then it was linked that the child was in the yard which he guarded, so it linked him to the body as well. And when we did the post-mortem, we couldn't really identify. It was very hard to identify the remains, because we weren't able to. We took the molars, we took the hip bone, we took part of the skull scrapings for DNA testing to see if we could make a link. We drew the mom and dad's blood to see if we could build a profile, and that we were unable to do that because it was too far decomposed. The child's body, the skull was basically nearly done. And then the finger points, the fingers of which were just above the ground, were eaten by the rodents and animals. It was eaten smallly like that. So there was no prints either. And the body was very badly decomposed at that stage as well.
So had there been an attempt to fully bury him and he'd become exposed, or how was he positioned?
So often what we see with, perpetrators committing murder is they think that burying someone is an easy thing to do. And it was pretty hot in Kimberly at this time, so the ground was really solid. And we think what this perpetrator had attempted to do was, he would have loved to have gone 6 feet down, but only managed to get it, the body slightly submerged, and then just threw all manner of other items he could find over the body, building rubble and that sort of thing to try and conceal him, but certainly did a very poor job.
When questioned about a body found at a house Tommy Williams was guarding, he at first denied even being Tommy. Once that was cleared up, he set about giving his version of events. First of all, addressing the victim's father's tools found in his possession. Tommy told police that the mystery assailant had threatened to kill him if he didn't assist in the murder. But to investigators, that certainly didn't explain his behavior following the incident. The facts were simple. There was a missing boy. There were the remains of a body of the right age found near to the boy's home. These remains had been scientifically assessed to have been there since roughly the same time of the disappearance. There were blood trails in the house, and a suspect had been detained and was in custody, who admitted that he had assisted in the killing and burying of the body. Police were confident a trial could now proceed. But sadly, nothing is ever a certainty. Tommy Williams had apparently gotten away with murder in 1987. It looked like this might happen again in 2004. While under arrest on suspicion of the murder of 13-year-old Tabang, he tried to make allegations that sangomas and muti were the motives for murder. Despite his efforts, there seemed to be a lot of evidence pointing at Tommy, who had admitted to at least assisting in the murder. However, Tabang's father would never accept that the body that was found was in fact his son. And when prosecutors refused to charge Tommy, it appeared that he had once again gotten away with murder. How did this case get on your radar?
The first time I came across Tommy Williams was really almost by coincidence. A colleague of mine and myself had been, I think, in Cape Town doing work, Captain Elmarie Myburg. And we were driving back, because those days the cops didn't let us fly anywhere. We had to literally drive everywhere, which was great to see the country, but time consuming. So we typically, on that long distance back driving up, you can either drive via Bloemfontein, which is the one sort of biggish town on that route, or via Kimberly, typically a quieter route, more scenic perhaps. So we stopped off in Kimberly, and of course we knew a lot of the cops there because we'd often do work on cases. And they said, hey, we've just had this case come in, a body was discovered on this property in a small town called Warrenton, which is, I guess, 30-40 minutes from Kimberly, along that same highway towards Pretoria. And we picked up a guy, and he's here, don't you want to sit in on the interview? And that's typically something we would do, is help interview suspects. So we sat in on that interview. Now, that particular case itself, this was now April 2004, a little 13-year-old boy gone missing, and what believed to be his remains had been found on an empty house, at an empty house. Mm-hmm. So essentially, it was a house. This town, it was not doing well in this town. So a lot of houses were abandoned or up for sale or up for auction. And the insurance company had placed the guy to stay in the house, because if you don't, you get squatters that move in, etc. So Tommy Williams had been tasked to look after that house. He'd been there for, I guess, a couple of weeks, and he'd asked to be relocated to a different house suddenly. And the new guy who came to sort of stay in the house was doing a bit of cleaning up in the garden. And at the back garden, he saw like a pile of shrubs and sticks and branches, and he saw kind of poking out a human head, a skull, really. At that point, there was no flesh left. And he kind of scratched a bit more, like, okay, this is definitely a human head. The cops get called in, and they kind of find a decomposed, small-sized body, and wrapped in kind of a duvet cover. Mm-hmm. And the other part of that duvet cover was inside the house. It was being used as a curtain. So the guy who reports this says, well, Tommy Williams was staying here before me, clearly not a fresh body, so it's not me. And he was identified as 13-year-old Tabang, who stayed in that town and who'd obviously been missing for quite a while. So as I said, that we interview him, and he comes up with a sort of fancy story that, yes, he knew this kid. He had given him these items that was found in his possession, the tools, the jewelry, etc. The boy had given that voluntarily to him. And that one day he comes back and he finds some other guy, unknown to him who this person is, busy strangling the boy. And this other guy, who is unknown to him, says to him, "You better help me hold this kid's legs." So that was kind of his little version of events. He also tried to make allegations that it was a traditional healer. In South Africa, we get what perhaps the other parts of the world they will call a witch doctor, and how they sometimes use human body parts for medicinal purposes, or the bad ones, or the charlatans. So he had these kind of weird versions, and the detective felt, well, this is good enough to charge him, and presented the case to the prosecutor, saying, we found these items in his possession. He's given this really fantastical nonsense story about being present during the murder. He didn't come to the police afterwards, if anything, even if that was the case.
Right.
And some random stranger just is killing a kid in the house. He's looking. That just really didn't make sense. And the prosecutor declined to actually prosecute the case. So there was a big falling out between this detective and that particular prosecutor that I think till this day they don't talk to each other. And it's very difficult because in that town, if you're one of the big detectives and you're talking to one of the big prosecutors, it's a big issue. And he's kind of released and sent on his way. And for us, as I said, we were literally passing through the town, we interview this guy, and we carry on with our daily lives and our cases,
right.
And that's kind of it. Nothing comes of it. A single case, didn't prosecute. Nothing left for us to do.
I completely respect your words, your attitude, and the fact that you did your job, you took it as far as you could, and then you gave it to those to make a decision. Even though you didn't agree with the decision, you respect it. How does that, on a personal level, how does that make you feel when you go home at night and you turn the lights out? Are you worried that there's a killer still out there that you could have behind bars? And did you struggle with the decision personally?
Yes, I did. I struggled with the decision personally. I can remember there's a lot of emotionally for yourself. It's like you believe you've got the right person. I believed that he would do it again.
Right.
I also believed that with the child, like Tabang B, when his dad, his father didn't want to accept that it was his child in the mortuary when we did try to do the identity. Those are words I never forget personally. It's the fact about it was the underwear and it was the clothes that the body was discovered in. The father said to us, "But you can find that clothes at any Pep or Ackerman store in the country. It's not my son." He didn't want to accept that it was his child. He believed his child was kidnapped and his child was somewhere still alive. He didn't want to accept the death. And for me, I remember that the hardest part for me was that child was never buried or given it was given a burial as a pauper. But the child itself, that little boy, was put in a pauper's grave, and it haunts you. That haunts you for the rest of your life, because I'm a father of children. I've got 2 kids of my own, and I've got my stepkids as well. And having children of your own, you would never want that for your child. You never want your child to be marked in an unmarked grave. But the father and mom passed away, and I know the brother phoned me at some stage to ask me. Then I said to him, "He's in a pauper's grave." But it's the fact that haunts you. Yes, on a personal level, that is, you feel like a failure when it happens. You feel like you didn't do enough. You think to yourself, what if I did a little bit more? Because we did arrange for a confession. I got the legal aid services out on the day that he was arrested. Because he said, when he was talking, you've got to read him his rights, and you've got to allow him, if he wants to make a confession, to go to a magistrate and do it in chambers and let it be done. And when the legal aid board came out, the person from legal aid board came out, they said they advised him to remain silent. And he chose to remain silent, and that's why there was never turned into a confession. It was only the admission that he made to me during questioning.
Right.
So you don't have that strong point of the confession, which would have carried weight, maybe to have put him in court. There's things that when you feel there's lots of avenues what more would that have convinced that prosecutor to prosecute?
Right.
What did you do short?
Right.
What was your shortcomings?
Right. In the matter of the murder of a 28-year-old disabled man named Norman Watermeyer, the deceased had last been seen walking with a man named Tommy Williams. After his disappearance, Tommy made anonymous phone calls to Norman's family, who he knew, claiming that Norman had left town out of fear for an upcoming medical procedure. He went on to implicate someone named Tefu. However, police who had previously seen Tommy evade prosecution for another murder had their sights fixed on just one person. So 2004, we have the disappearance and murder of young Tabang. In 2008, there's another case that comes up on Detective Louise's radar. Tell me about that case.
Yeah, so it's basically February 2008, now in a little suburb of Kimberly itself, whereas the other one was in Warrenton, as I said, a couple, 30, 40 minutes outside of Kimberly. And essentially, Tommy Williams was the last guy seen walking with Norman Watermeyer. Now, Norman was a 28-year-old guy, partially disabled in the sense he had quite a severe spine deformation, which made him less perhaps agile as the rest of us. And he disappears. And his body is found a couple of days later. I can't remember exactly offhand how long afterwards. Partially burnt, fairly decomposed in certain areas. But in between that time, before the body is discovered, someone anonymously phones a family to say, look, Norman was supposed to go for an operation for his back, which he was, but he's too scared to do it, so he's left town. And kind of, boom, that's kind of the extent of, I think, 1 or 2 phone calls to that sort of extent with the family. So now they're thinking, okay, but who was this, and okay, has he fled, he didn't, etc. Yeah. So I guess at that point it's really just a missing persons. And then eventually the body is found, and Tommy Williams actually accompanies the family to go and identify the body.
So they were friends. They were known to one another.
Yeah.
So Tommy Williams is placed at the discovery site of the body.
Correct.
He is now tied in with 2 murders. Was there a connection made back to 1987 at that point?
Unfortunately, not in 2004. That connection would only be made in 2008. So we had a really good investigator on this case, Fernando Luis. The detective realized that this was not going to be the last he heard of Tommy Williams. And in 2008, a disabled man, Norman Watermeyer, disappeared, I believe I think it was 90 kilometers from where Tabang had been murdered. Mm-hmm. Norman Watermeyer he was born with a spinal difficulty that had made walking very difficult. He'd done the types of work that he could, sort of menial labor, whatever he could. He lived with his family. And he was set to have an operation in the very near future that would significantly increase his quality of life. His spinal issues were going to sort of be vastly repaired. He'd have a lot less pain, so he was really looking forward to that. On the day that Norman disappeared, his mother had asked him to go to the shop to purchase a prepaid electricity voucher. And of course, reminiscent of what had happened in 1987 with Marta, and he never came home.
Let's go back there to that day. What were the circumstances of that disappearance?
So 8-year-old Marta Buerta was sent to the local shop by her mom to buy a loaf of bread, I believe. And of course, that would not have been a strange thing to do back in that time. Even today in certain communities, children will pop down to the shop to buy something for their parents. Right. Unfortunately, Marta never came back. And she was missing for several days. Her family searched for her. Eventually, she was discovered and in an abandoned stadium, but quite far into the stadium, where it would be strange to just stumble upon her there. and her body was also covered. There was significant measures taken to conceal the crime and conceal her body, and yet we had the 16-year-old boy who claimed he'd gone into the stadium to grab a drink, even though most of the community knew that water facilities had been shut off to the stadium a long time before, and he'd stumbled upon her body.
Was there any link between Tommy and the victim on the day of her disappearance?
So there was a man who lived close to the shop where Martha was intended to go to buy the loaf of bread. And he had told a police officer that he had seen Tommy Williams and Martha walking together on the day of her disappearance.
They were seen together. He was the one that found the body.
Correct.
It sort of, things are stacking up. His age was really the thing that got him out of hot water when he was 16.
Absolutely.
Can you describe the 2008 incident and then how Tommy Williams' name came up in it?
It was in 2008. It was on a Sunday still. I remember it was a Sunday afternoon after Sunday lunch. I received a call from our then detective head for the province, Director Dani. He called. They called and they said, I must please report to his office. It was in the afternoon. I arrived there. There was people sitting inside there, and then they asked me, you investigated Tommy Williams before? Then I said yes, and then they said to me, but this family believes that their child is in the mortuary, and that Tommy Williams is the person that showed them where their child is, and they believe that there's something untoward. Then I still spoke. The mother was there. It was Norman Watermeyer. It was the person that was deceased, and it was Mrs. Watermeyer's mom. She sat there and she said to me, it is her child in the mortuary. Then I still said to her, but if it's your child, you need to convince me so that I can go back to the mortuary and speak to the doctor. Because the doctor was telling her it's not her child because, well, he wasn't a child. He was in his 20s, but it was her child, still a child, basically. And then she said that the body in the mortuary, she believes it to be her son. And the doctor said to her, from the day that she reported him missing, it was not the same time period that the decomposition of the body in the mortuary was compared to what he believed it to be as the doctor. So the mom said to me, her son was supposed to go for a back operation. And the child, he was supposed to be in the hospital, and the thing, he was scared of it. So then I said to her, okay, but do you have anything that we can identify him with x-rays, with dental? And the mom said, but I've got his x-rays for the operation. And then she brought that to me. Then I went to that stage district surgeon. Her name was Denise Lawrence. She was in charge, but it wasn't her that did the post-mortem. It was another doctor. Then I said to her, Doc, I'm in disagreement because the mom says this is her child. I would like us to redo the post-mortem. The body's still in the mortuary. Can we not have another look? I know I'm asking a lot, but then the mom explained to me when Norman Watermeyer was young, he had heart problems as well. So he was taken by the Red Cross plane to Cape Town, and he was operated on, and he had open heart surgery. And on his chest, when it comes to a child, they put cloth. It's a cloth stitch, not a steel. When in adult males, you'll have a steel plate with a steel stitch combining your chest bone together. And with the child, it will be a cloth stitch because the child grows. And then the doc said to me, Doc Lawrence said to me, Fernando, if we go to the mortuary, we open the chest and we find it like that, and then we look at this, then we will definitely do the second post-mortem, and we'll do it according to that. And then we went there, and when we got to the mortuary, what I saw was they put the body on the pan, and on the body there were still pieces of cardboard underneath it, which looked like it had burned. Now, in the Northern Cape, one thing about the Northern Cape which you must remember is a body decomposes much faster because of the heat. Mm-hmm. Now you've got a body that's decomposed, but now you've got fire underneath it as well, which accelerates it. So automatically now that body, remember the doc was saying it's so many weeks that this body's decomposed over. So he's taking it in normal, but now you've got fire underneath it, and you've got the Northern Cape sun, which would have made it the decomposition much more. But that's now, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a pathologist, but it's my experience of the bodies that I've picked up in the Northern Cape, how quick they decompose. They decompose very fast because of the heat.
Tommy Williams, the city killer, had once again come under police scrutiny when the body of disabled Norman Watermeyer was discovered in 2008. As he had previously, Tommy placed himself directly in the police sights by volunteering information and offering up potential suspects in the matter. In this instance, he went so far as going with the victim's family to identify his body. Despite getting away with murder twice before, Tommy's sense of invincibility would soon play a part in his ultimate capture. Tommy goes to ID the body with the family. How did suspicion start to land on Tommy Williams?
So some people said, but you know, that guy you phoned, his voice sounds very much like Tommy Williams's. So the family go pick up Tommy, take him out into the veld, have a conversation with him, and he eventually confesses, which they then record on their cell phone, his confession that he had actually committed the murder.
We then looked for Tommy Williams. We couldn't find him. He was missing. During that time period, information came that he was in Rhodopon. That's a small suburb outside Kimberly. And that he was at that stage fixing cell phones and that. And then a person came forward with the information because there was a reward out for it. And they said to us, but he's at this address, at this house. So we arranged basically a takedown immediately because we thought if he was there now, we need to do it. Doesn't matter. It was broad daylight, but we had to do it during the day because we were scared if he moves, he's gone. Yeah. Because we had information that he was at that house. And then we had a team put together and when we got to the house, I was in the backyard and the other guys came through the front. And as they were going in, penetrating the house from the front, he was jumping out the back window and we arrested him. So it was with the team of detectives, with my colleagues. We brought him, we arrested him. We then discovered that he was also living in the area of Windsorton, just outside Kimberley, which is also a small mining, with a lot of mining, diamond mining, prospecting going on. There he had a girlfriend who stayed in a shanty and that. We met her. She had a pair of shoes. She had Norman Watermeyer's shoes in her house. And then she had CDs with her. And then there was things that we linked to Norman Watermeyer. Right. So again, it was deja vu again, basically. It was the same thing repeating itself. Right. It was going back to Tabang B. The same, similar type of evidence again.
How was Norman killed?
There was evidence of strangulation. Actually, no, cause of death was confirmed as strangulation. And the boy from 2004, he was quite decomposed, but there was a shoelace around his neck. So the autopsy report said, could not confirm it, but strangulation, ligature strangulation could not be excluded.
So he's charged with the murder of Norman. He is not yet charged with the 2004 murder of Tabang. What happens next? Do we go right to trial, or?
So as Fernando was obviously building the case, gathering further evidence, etc., someone says to him, you know, what's interesting is that I recall many years ago, back in '87, that Tommy Williams' name popped up in a murder case of a young girl.
This is 2008?
Yeah.
How old is Tommy Williams at this point?
Tommy, at the point of his arrest, he was born in 1970, so that's...
Okay, so he's 38.
38 now, with that time of the last murder.
So all of a sudden, suspicion comes up from 1987 when he would have been 16 or 17 years old.
16, yeah.
Detective Fernando Luis gets a tip-off that someone remembers having lived in the same town as Tommy Williams when he was a teenager. And they just think that the detective should know that there was a young girl murdered in that town and that Tommy Williams had discovered the body, but they could remember nothing else. They could only remember the year, 1987, couldn't remember the victim's name, and remembered vaguely that Tommy Williams had some sort of involvement. So what the detective now does, he decides he's going to go to the library archive of newspapers, start scrolling through archived newspapers manually, looking for the murder of a child. And thankfully, in March of 1987, finds the headline he's looking for.
Tying Tommy to that incident.
Well, eventually identifying Marta Buerta as his victim. So now he's got a victim's name.
Oh, so it was that?
Yeah, he didn't even have a victim's name. Yeah. So now he has a victim's name. But as we said, technology-wise, back then, dockets weren't digitized. They weren't on any form of computer system. They were handwritten and kept in a filing cupboard somewhere. You know, there was the chances of him even finding this docket from 1987 were slim to none. So he goes to the pertinent police station. The filing clerk says, well, we do have a bit of a problem because the door to the filing office the lock has been broken for quite a few years. So what we've been doing is we've just been pushing the dockets through a hole in the door.
With 3 cases now on their radar that all linked to Tommy Williams, Luis moved to consolidate the investigation. In order to investigate the Botha case, the docket from the time of the incident was vital. But after such a long time, the chances that it could be found were very, very slim. So Luis went to work.
So again, the other miracle is Fernando actually finds the original detective. He actually finds the original district surgeon who did the autopsy. And he actually finds the witnesses that remember seeing Tommy walking with this girl beyond where she would have gone to buy the bread. So I think God wanted this case solved. Whichever God you believe in, I think that God wanted this case solved.
So you are now, you've got this man in your crosshairs. Once again, you are building the case towards the 2008 crime, towards Norman's murder. How does the 1987 murder of Marta come up?
It was during this time period when Colin Wattermeyer had questioned Tommy Williams. That during that thing, Tommy Williams blamed, I think the guy's name's Tefo. He blamed him for the murder, saying it was him that did it. Then the community was up in arms and they wanted to harm this Tefo. So automatically, you got to follow every lead you have.
Right.
So I followed up on this Tefo and I got to him, I questioned him. I asked him for his alibi. He gave me a reasonable explanation. And he also explained to me, and he said to me, but he wasn't there. He doesn't know anything about this. He does know who Tommy Williams is. And then while we were doing this interview with him, he said to me, but you know something, what about the little girl that was killed? Then I said to him, what do you mean? He says to me, there was a little girl killed a long time ago. Then I said to him, but if you're saying this and you know about it, you need to tell me more. And that's when he came forward and he gave us the information that there was a child killed, and it was, she was killed, her name, the Mrs. Botha. And I asked him, where was this? And he said to me, no, Tommy Williams stayed in this area of Galeshui, in the area of Vergenoeg. And he took me and he started showing me where this Mrs. Botha was, but she didn't stay there no more. Then we tried to trace her, and I found her finally it's the old Zulu hostels, they call it, in Galeshui. I found her in that area, and when I approached her, she was there, and then she said to me, no, my name is Mrs. Botha. And then I said to her, do you know okay, but I forgot about that first. The first thing what I did is we then went, Mrs. Botha, then she gave me a death certificate, on a little piece of paper. On this piece of paper, this child's name is written there. But it's now, when you have a post-mortem in those years, you would be given a piece of paper, a form, that you would have to take to Home Affairs to register the death, which the mom had to do. But she kept this piece of paper in her purse all these years, from 1987. And then she gave that to me, and then with that piece of paper, I went to, and I asked her, but she said to me, no, this was headline news in Kimberly at that time, where the child was killed. But the child's murder was never solved. Then she mentions that there was a newspaper article, and then she also mentioned, so I went, there was a journalist, Jana Grobelaar. She then said to me, because I asked her, I said, where would we find it? She said to me, what, the Afrikaner Library in Kimberly keeps all the newspapers from the Diamondfield Advertiser from 100 years, but from basically it's a large volume of newspapers kept there. So now we've got an idea on the more or less the date. So we went to the newspaper articles, we looked through it, and we found the article where this little girl was found strangled near a sports field, in a shallow grave. Everything, all those things are similar again. So now armed with this, I went to the Galeshewe police station. Now we had to try and find the dockets, because remember, murder dockets don't get destroyed. They get kept. So we had to look for that murder docket, and there was a clerk there that helped me. And the station commander at that stage was Director Marburg, Brigadier Marburg. And he said to me, you know what, we had to move from one station to the new station. All the old dockets are in a cell, and we've still got to sort them out. And when we got there, it was like a pyramid of paper from the floor to the ceiling that was just lying there. Then I said to them, you know what, we have to look for this thing, because maybe it might lead to some further evidence.
The filing clerk decides, when he hears the story this detective has got to say, he wants to be part of this. So he breaks down the door and starts to manually go through these dockets himself, through each and every dust-covered one, until he eventually comes across the docket pertaining to the murder of Martha Botha in 1987.
And that's when Tommy's name is in that file.
Correct.
And if you're Detective Luis, it's the eureka.
Absolutely. And added to that, the method of death, which was strangulation, which drew into the similar fact evidence, the fact that he covered her body the same as he did with his other victims, the fact that she was a child or a vulnerable person. All of those things could then be drawn in. He discovered her body. He had no reason to be there. And the IPU could now sit and draw up a linkage analysis of all of the similar fact evidence and say, not that Tommy Williams committed these three crimes, because that's not the purpose of a linkage analysis. A linkage analysis will just tell you that by basis of the similar fact evidence, the same offender must have committed these three crimes.
Right.
And then it's the prosecutor's job to say, well, that offender is Tommy Williams.
Right. Whether South Africa's longest known active serial killer murdered more people or not may never be known. The Tommy Williams case is an example of how a killer in the right context can slip through the cracks. Ultimately, it took the dogged work of a detective named Fernando Luis to capture Tommy. Going to the extent of hunting for and finding the original 1987 murder docket linked to Tommy's first murder. Luis would stop at nothing to prove the guilt of a man he knew had killed before, and who would no doubt eventually kill again. So as Detective Luis starts to tell the story of Martha's murder in 1987, did you address that with Tommy, or was he?
So he was denying everything. He still was adamant that he didn't kill anybody ever.
Yeah.
So not particularly cooperative, which, I mean, that's not surprising. That's why you're a policeman. You gather evidence to prove someone is responsible for a crime. But they got a really great prosecutor, and they decided that they're going to charge on all accounts, all three.
1987, 2004, 2008, 3 murders, multiple robberies, etc., etc. Talk to me about the trial.
So this is where sort of my evidence, I become relevant again in this whole case, because we don't have direct evidence linking Tommy to any of these crimes. It's circumstantial. He's found in possession of items. He was last seen walking with. Possible confession, maybe. We have to see how that's going to be seen by the actual court.
Then there was a person in the docket that was mentioned that saw Tommy Williams walking in the direction of the sports stadium with this little girl. And we had to find this witness. Now, it's the 1987 docket. We're now in 2008. Now I'm looking for this person. So I went to Home Affairs. I went everywhere, and I couldn't find this person. And during my search for this person, end of the day, I found this person working at an engineering place across the road from the police headquarters.
Oh,
That's how close that person was to me all the time, just across the road. He wasn't far away. And when I found him, his memory was clear. He remembered everything. And he told us, no, I owned this house. I was sitting on my porch. I watched this child walk past, and I watched this guy walk with Tommy Williams walk.
We've got 3 victims now, 3 cases. Is Tommy Williams charged with all 3 at this point?
Yes, we collected all the evidence. On the Norman Watermeyer case, we opposed bail. We kept him in custody successfully. It was done in the lower courts in Kimberly. We kept him in custody. We opposed the bail. And then from there, we also again, it goes to the DPP for a decision. But at this stage, I believed we had more than sufficient evidence for him to be prosecuted on all 3. So it was only getting the DPP's office to buy in, which they did. Right. At that stage, they bought into the case. They believed that there was a strong case for all 3, and they decided to go to trial on all 3 cases.
Also through Fernando's investigations, it turns out that Tommy had a history of assaulting his girlfriends. And they were prepared to make statements against Tommy. So we have, not only is it the sort of 3 murder cases within the 3 different victims who've been killed, the attempted rape of the young girl because there was indication of genital tampering. We've got a charge of kidnapping of the little, when you lead the person away, theft, assault, but of course also these 2 counts of assault with grievous bodily harm where he had assaulted 2 of his girlfriends, which I think, if I recall correctly, also involved strangulation. Mm-hmm. So they decided, we're going to go to court on all of these and let the court decide.
Wow. What was the result of the trial?
So I was the final evidence witness in the trial, and my job really was to comment on the similarities across the 3 cases, but I was focusing mainly on just the murder cases. So we had, all 3 victims were vulnerable. The little girl was 8, Tommy was 16. Then we have Tabang who was 13, Tommy was, I think, in his 20s at that point in time. So again, big
30s.
Age gap. Yeah, big age gap. Then we have Norman, who was partially disabled. So they have a vulnerability. On the surface, you don't really realize it, but when you start to look at Tommy in relation to the victims, and then Norman with his disability, he was always in a dominant position over them. So that's the one aspect. They were vulnerable in some way towards Tommy. All 3 had post-mortem tampering of the bodies. So the little boy who had been buried, after wrapped up in the duvet and buried. The little girl had been partially buried and covered with rubbish. And with Norman in 2008, he had sort of set fire to the body, lighter fluid or petrol, whatever it was. So after the fact, tampering with the body with each body was another similarity. And then all cases had indications of strangulation. So even if the little girl from 87, they couldn't confirm cause of death was this, or I think she was confirmed as ligature. Tabang he had the ligature around the neck.
Yes.
And Norman was also a cause of death strangulation. So we have a similarity in that aspect also. And there were some smaller details that we also commented on. And he's ultimately found guilty, and the judge significantly relied on the similar fact evidence for all 3 of the murders to support the convictions in the other murders using the similar fact evidence principle.
What was Tommy's sentence?
So Tommy was given, unfortunately, because in 1987 the Minimum Sentences Act was not in force, the judge could only give 10 years for Martha's murder. So he was given 10 years for that, but 2004 and 2008 fell under the Minimum Sentences Act, and thankfully for Tabang and Norman's murders, he received 2 life sentences.
So concurrently?
Correct, yes.
So at 25 years, Tommy Williams will be eligible for parole?
Correct, yes.
I'm going to ask you a personal question. You're somebody who's clearly very invested in your work. The motivation to serve the families is there for you and to honor the victims. Describe to me the feeling that comes over to you when you hear those verdicts.
You feel complete. You feel it's a job done. And then it's basically, it's over. You got to move on. You got to find something else to do. You must move on to the next one. And yes, you could to see to me, Mrs. Botha, for example, when the case was on trial, to see how she looked when she received justice, I don't know how to explain it, but there's a sense of completion in a moment. You could see that she had her answers. It wasn't no more the lady that I met that gave me the piece of paper. It was a lady that had come to peace with a child's murder, and that the right murderer was convicted. Colin Watermeyer, the brother, I remember he cried sometimes, he'd cry bitterly in that. And also at the end, he looked like he had found justice. So that was the reward, was seeing the justice for those people.
There's many people that are glad that you are giving your 100% and continue to do so. It's amazing how this, all of these crimes became connected, and you put a killer behind bars, Colonel Lewis. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you.
There's not one single person that solves a crime. You always have a team around you. Remember, it's the doctor, the pathologists, it's the detectives on the scene the first time, it's the witnesses, it's your prosecutors. It takes a team effort to solve a case. It's not one individual by himself. And I honestly can say, in this case of Tommy Williams, it was a team effort. There's a lot of colleagues that worked also around the clock behind the scene. I mean, like the clerk that found the docket in that pile of pyramids, the pathologist that said second time round, the pathologist 1987, the previous investigating officer. There's so many people that contribute towards the success of the case docket. It's like Prof. Labuschagne, Gerard. They would come from Gauteng to come and to analyze and to see and guide you and say, you know what, you're on the right track. So you've got a lot of people that put a lot of effort to make your case a success. And there's no way as a person can take credit alone. That's what I'd like to say.
In 2009, Tommy was found guilty on multiple counts and sentenced to 2 life terms plus 10 years for his first murder, which was committed while he was still a minor. Psychologists are sometimes divided on our ability to rehabilitate personalities such as Tommy's. But in a country with no such sentence as life without parole, how they profile such a mind will often impact whether killers like Tommy will ever be released back into society.